So good afternoon. This conversation, the fourth of 2 Centuries of Jacksonville series for 2022, is a production of the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund and the Jaxson magazine. Launched from Modern Cities in association with WJCT Public Broadcasting, the Jaxson is a multimedia project dedicated to urbanism and culture on Florida's First Coast. This event is also sponsored by the Florida chapter of the American Planning Association's First Coast section and is eligible for 1.5 credits for all certified planners in attendance today. My name is Ennis Davis, and I'm a senior planner with Venetian Company, a public historian, vice president of membership and outreach for the Florida chapter of the American Planning Association, and the Florida Trust Historic Preservation trustee as well as the co-founder of online media productions, the JacksonMag.com and ModernCities.com. And I'll be one of your co-panelists for today's discussion. Before we dive into today's topic, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. Number one, to everyone, please introduce yourselves in the chat box if you have not already. Number two, this session will be recorded and sent out to all registered participants next week. A follow-up survey to all participants will also be sent out next week. Number three, Lily Weinstein from the DuPont Fund is available for tech support. So please use the chat function for troubleshooting requests, which we've already had a few today that we've worked on. And then number four, we have reserved time for a Q&A after, actually throughout the panel process. So please use the Q&A box in your Zoom controls for any questions that you will have anytime during this conversation today. Our focus of today will be on the impacts of consolidation. And with that said, I am happy to introduce Rick Mullaney, who is the founder and director of the Jacksonville University Public Policy Institute, and as well as a political analyst for WJXT's Channel 4 and WOKV, or 104.5 FM radio station in Jacksonville, as my co-panelist and presenter today. So I'm going to give Rick a little time to introduce himself. I respect Rick a lot, but he can tell you more about himself than I can. So it's all yours, Rick.
Well, thank you, Ennis. It's great to be with all of you. As Ennis just mentioned, I'm actually the Surecliff Executive Director of the Public Policy Institute here at Jacksonville University. And I hope you're interested in this, but we were the first university in the state of Florida to offer a master's degree in public policy. This is the 10th anniversary of the Institute. Harvard conferred the first MPP degree in the history of the country in the early 70s. And here at Jacksonville University, we conferred the first MPP degree in the history of Florida. Other schools, the University of Central Florida, the University of Miami, have added MPP degrees and more are coming, and we think that's a great thing. We also here at the Public Policy Institute offer an executive MPP degree for those with at least 7 years of work experience, and 3 dual degree programs, an MPP Juris Doctor, MPP MBA, and MPP Marine Science dual degree program. In addition to our academic program, as you may have seen, we convene public policy events on campus as a nonpartisan, neutral forum, and over the past decade have become one of the leading venues in Florida for public policy education, discussion, and debate. And that includes 12 televised debates with Channel 4 on our campus over the last 10 years. And thirdly, as part of the Institute, is community engagement. We try with events like this today. I'm pleased to be a part of this conversation. We want to engage with the community, whether it's on television, radio, these kinds of events, and others, to engage the community. Briefly, by background, I went to the University of Florida for undergrad and law school. I have a mixed marriage. My wife went to Florida State, but I have brainwashed the kids successfully. They are Gator fans. When I first got out of school, I was in private practice at a very large law firm, was a prosecutor for a while. I did spend 20 years at City Hall as legal counsel and an advisor to 3 administrations, Ed Austin, John Delaney, and John Payton. And at the end of that time, I've been at Jacksonville University for the last 10 years, and it's a pleasure to be with all of you today.
Thank you, Rick. I really appreciate that. And I really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us for today. So we hope that all participants this day will leave this session with a better understanding of the following learning objectives. Number one, what consolidation is and what it isn't. Number two, to get a full breadth of government restructuring that took place during consolidation here in town. Number three, to better understand how Jacksonville's consolidation and merger or reconstruction of its government compares to other consolidated cities in the country. Number 4, understanding the unexpected outcomes of consolidation. And then number 5, challenges and opportunities that we face today as a result of consolidation. So to get us started, throughout Jacksonville's history, it has been a city that has achieved a significant number of accomplishments and has had a number of influential contributions on the development of modern day society. An example would be not only surviving the Great Fire in 1901, but rapidly rebuilding to become Florida's first major urban center in a span of less than 10 years. That fire, which was the 3rd largest in urban fire in American history behind the 1906 San Francisco earthquake and the 1871 Chicago fire, destroyed 146 city blocks, 2,000 buildings, took 7 lives, and left 9,000 residents homeless in the process. In addition, while Chicago, St. Louis, and Memphis and the Mississippi Delta may claim the blues, the actual first published account of the blues singing being sung on a public stage actually happened in Jacksonville in a performance in Louisville in 1910. Appearing in the Indianapolis Freeman stage under the name of an article, Jacksonville Theatrical Notes, the reviewer stated that Professor John W.F. Woods, who was a ventriloquist with his doll Henry, set the air dome wild on stage by making Little Henry drunk. And to make Little Henry drunk, the blues was used as a part of that drunken act. However, one of our city's most significant accomplishments took place in 1968 with the consolidation or reconstruction of the government of the city of Jacksonville and Duval County. Today, we're a 747 square mile city. We are a city that you can throw the cities of Boston, Manhattan, Miami, San Francisco, Pittsburgh, DC, and Chicago into our limits. And as a result, there are a number of controversial things that we've had to tackle as a consolidated city. Many things that we'll try to discuss through today. But there have been significant benefits associated with our restructuring. For example, we no longer have a decline in tax base. Our government, our local government, has become much more efficient through the elimination of duplicate services as well. Yet we still have a number of challenges. Just on the screen here, you can see the neighborhoods of Springfield, Arlington, Cosmo, and Bartram Park. At 747 square miles of land area, we are a city with hundreds of unique neighborhoods with totally different history, culture, demographics, and sometimes their hyperlocal needs can get lost in the process of being a large machine. However, they say there's nothing new under the sun. And with that in mind, we're not the only consolidated city in the country. In fact, there are several. So to get started with today's discussion, I'm going to share a few. Home to one of the most vibrant, entertainment-oriented downtowns in the Sun Belt, the city of Nashville consolidated its government with Davidson County in 1963, forming a metropolitan government structure with a council that features more than 40 seats, of which 5 members are elected at large. Indianapolis is the 3rd largest city in the Midwest behind Chicago and Columbus, Ohio. Home to the largest collection of monuments dedicated to veterans and war casualties in the US outside of Washington, DC, the city of Indianapolis and Marion County have had a consolidated city-county form of government since 1970 with 25 council members. A short distance away from Indianapolis is Louisville. And since 2003, Louisville has been consolidated with Jefferson County. And the administrative entity created by this merger, the Louisville Jefferson County Metro Government, also includes 26 council districts. Out west in California, the city of San Francisco and the counties in the seat of San Francisco County since 1856 have been consolidated, covering the land area of 46.9 square miles. San Francisco in San Francisco County is the second most densely populated large U.S. city after New York City in the country, and the fifth most densely populated county in the country. Coming back to the Sun Belt, an older example of a consolidated city is New Orleans. Well known for its distinctive music, Creole cuisine, unique dialects, annual celebrations and festivals. New Orleans and Orleans Parish is a consolidated city parish consisting of 7 council members, including 2 serving at large. Covering 601 square miles, the city and county of Honolulu have been consolidated since the city's charter was adopted in 1907 and accepted by the legislature of the territory of Hawaii. However, as Hawaii is the only state with no incorporated places below the county level, the U.S. Census Bureau recognizes the approximate area commonly referred to as the city of Hawaii as a Census County Division, or CCD. Considered to be the economic and cultural anchor of the Delaware Valley, Philadelphia and Philadelphia County have been in coexistence since an act of consolidation in 1854. Following an amendment to the state constitution in 1951, a new charter took place in January 1952, allowing the city and county to fully merge. And on January the 1st, 1974, Fayette County merged its government with that of its county seat of Lexington, creating a consolidated city-county governed by the Lexington-Fayette Urban County Government. Today, the Urban County Council is a 15-member legislative group with 12 members representing specific districts and 3 elected as at-large council members. To throw another loop into this discussion, we have Washington, D.C. And while the District of Columbia is a federal district and not only a county, the city has had a consolidated municipal form of government since 1871. Prior to then, Washington, Georgetown, and the incorporated county of Washington were separate jurisdictions within the District of Columbia. And prior to 1846, when it was retroceded to Virginia, the South Bank of the District of Columbia was the county of Alexandria, which is now the independent cities of Alexandria and the county of Arlington. Then there's the largest city in the US, New York City, which is coextensive with a network of what was 5 counties in New York, which are New York County, the Bronx County, Kings County, which is also Brooklyn, Richmond County, which is Staten Island, and Queens counties. This form of consolidation took place in 1898, and today the New York City Council was a body consisting of 51 members, each elected from a geographic district. And then there is Lafayette, Louisiana. In 1996, the city of Lafayette and the parish of Lafayette consolidated by merging their governments. A main reason for that consolidation was because the parish government didn't have enough money to operate. Consolidation was supposed to eliminate some of the costs by eliminating some of the duplicate government positions in Lafayette. However, still struggling financially, voters amended that consolidated government's charter in 2018 to consider deconsolidation. However, after considering deconsolidation in May of this year, the Lafayette Parish Council appointed commission actually voted against the concept of deconsolidation. So I've said a mouthful going through a number of these cities today, and it may have confused you just as these onlookers on Main Street in the middle of downtown were confused by this accident in 1950. So what is this thing that we call consolidation today? To answer this question and more, I have Rick with me today as a co-presenter. Rick's going to take 15 to 20 minutes or so to discuss the different aspects of government restructuring, which is what a lot of us refer to today as consolidation, and highlight some of the most prominent outcomes of what's taken place here locally so far. I'll turn it over to you, Rick.
Well, Ennis, thank you very much. And thank all of you for being here today. Thank you, Ennis, for that presentation. I hope today is helpful. I hope it's informative. And I'd be willing to bet that some of the things we're going to talk about today you've never heard of before. As a starting point, let me just say, and I'm sure you've heard this, and it's true, we have here in Jacksonville the most unique form of local government in the state of Florida. And although you heard about a number of different consolidated cities around the country, there are variations with each. And we actually have one of the most unique forms of government in the country. This is the direct result, by the way, in 1968, of what is really the most significant local government restructuring in the history of Florida, and quite frankly, one of the most significant local government restructurings in the history of the country. And as we'll talk about today, there's much more to our form of government, and as Ennis mentioned, this restructuring than simply consolidation. That is one aspect. It is the most significant piece, but there are others. And if there's any one takeaway from today, I hope it's a little bit of understanding about the other pieces of what this government is and what it means for our future. By the way, after this restructuring over the years, certainly, and at Austin, by the way, and Mayor Hans Tanzler, two of our earlier mayors, when we restructured in 1968, Hans Tanzler said we had become the envy of the state of Florida. Ed Austin believed that it was the best form of local government in the country. It was the result of a crisis in the 60s that I'll talk about in a moment. But over time, since consolidation, a number of things began to change, and the NFL came to town, the Better Jacksonville plan was passed, a number of things happened, and a number of places around the country began to look to Jacksonville and our consolidated government and its pieces. The governor of New York, Governor Cuomo, and others invited me to come up to Albany a few years ago to talk to the people of New York and all of the 62 townships in New York about Jacksonville's consolidated government as a model. The same happened when Fred Smith, the CEO of Federal Express, through his lawyers in the Chamber of Commerce, asked me to come up to Memphis, which I did, to talk to them in Memphis about the Shelby County, the potential merger of Shelby County and the combination with the city of Memphis. Same in North Carolina and in Virginia, and of course, Pensacola, who looked to us to come over. Went over with Ed Austin to talk to them about Escambia County in Pensacola, and a 3-hour testimony before the Florida legislature, by the way, a few years back, on our form of government right here in Jacksonville. I can tell you that most of them focused on efficiency, as Ennis has mentioned, and on the potential ad valorem dividend, the sort of tax benefits of consolidation. But as I mentioned in New York, Memphis, North Carolina, and before the legislature, I'll mention to you, there's much more to this form of government than that, much bigger opportunities than that, and we'll talk about that. But in particular with consolidated government, there's an opportunity to do public policy on a countywide and even regional basis. And some policy issues such as transportation, the environment, public safety, and others really it's helped when you can do it on a more countywide and regional basis. So what I'd like to do very briefly, because I know you have some questions, is to talk a little bit of background and history as to the backdrop to this, then talk about the crisis that created it, and then in particular, what is this restructuring, and very briefly, maybe how it's worked and what do we look to for the future. By way of history, I always like to start this conversation in 1934 because it's one of the most significant events in the history of the city. And I do want to mention that Jacksonville University was founded in 1934. Now, that has nothing to do with what I'm going to talk about today, but I work at Jacksonville University, and I thought I would mention that to the group since you're all here today. We were founded in 1934. But in 1934, something else happened besides the founding of Jacksonville University, really significant. And that is the 1885, stay with me on this, it sounds boring, but it's really significant. And you'll be one of the few people in the city who know it. In the 1934 amendment to the 1885 Florida Constitution that put a provision in the Florida Constitution related just for Jacksonville. We call it the JCA, the Jacksonville Constitutional Amendment. And when I served as general counsel for the city, which I had the privilege of doing for 13 years, we had a 40-lawyer public office. We would often go back to this amendment as the basis for who we were. That constitutional amendment gave Jacksonville an extraordinary grant of constitutional authority under the Florida Constitution to abolish its city government, to abolish its county government, and then to put in place whatever it chose. And in fact, under that grant, it gave to the city of Jacksonville the greatest grant of home rule authority in the state of Florida. And by home rule, I'm talking about self-governance, autonomy, the ability to make decisions for yourself. It was very, very significant. And some of you may be asking why in 1934 did the people of Jacksonville and some of the civic leaders go to Tallahassee and amend the Florida Constitution to put in this 34 amendment that would allow Jacksonville this enormous constitutional authority to restructure? And the answer is in part several things, but one was public corruption. The 1930s was really the first wave of public corruption in Duval County. In the 1960s, we'd have another. And when I was a prosecutor in the 1980s with federal and state grand juries, we had a third wave of public corruption, but 75 people got indicted in the 1930s. In addition to that, the pre-68 model, our structure of government, as Ed Austin once said, was one of the most overlapping, duplicative, and wasteful in the country. If you wanted to create a model of inefficiency, as Ed Austin said, this would be it. We had a city council, we had a city commission, we had a public commission, we had a constitutional officers, and a partridge in a pear tree, as Ed would say. It was overlapping and duplicative. And by the way, many local governments were structured in that same manner. We did not have, and this is a term of art, that another important takeaway from today, what is a strong mayor form of government? That's a term of art. It means a mayor who heads up the executive branch of government. A weak mayor form of government is a mayor who serves on the legislative body, like the city council. You may be surprised to hear that of the 67 counties in the state of Florida, 67, only 3 have a strong mayor or strong executive form of government. Miami, which is actually Miami-Dade, Orlando, or actually Orange County, and Duval County. Those are the 3. The other 64, weak mayor. Of the more than 400 municipalities in the state of Florida, about 405 to 410 cities in the state of Florida, over 95 have weak mayor forms of government. And pre-1968, we also had a weak mayor form of government, meaning he did not head up at that time an executive branch, the mayor back in Jacksonville. In terms of legal services, everybody had their own counsel. In terms of structure, it was overlapping. And so you may say to yourself, well, Rick, given the waste and inefficiency, given the weak mayor form of government, given the challenges, which I can discuss legal services, and given the corruption, did Jacksonville consolidate or restructure in the 1930s? And the answer is it did not. And in my conversations in Memphis and in my conversations around the country, I tell them this kind of restructuring is challenging. There are built-in oppositions to restructuring. For example, current city employees are often very concerned they will lose their jobs because of efficiency. Developers and others, and lobbyists who do well with the current system don't want to change in the system. There's a fear of change. And so in the 1930s, it didn't happen. But then, and I say this tongue in cheek, in the 1960s, we were blessed, this is the tongue in cheek part, with the most significant crisis in the history of our city in the 1960s. Mainly public corruption, but there was much more to it than that. 4 of 9 city council members were indicted. 2 of the 5 city commissioners were indicted. The property appraiser, the council auditor got indicted. And when the property appraiser went in to testify before the grand jury, he took the 5th Amendment because the property appraiser had been evaluating property at such low values in favor to wealthy friends. The Duval County had the lowest capita per spending in education in the state of Florida, and the schools became disaccredited in 1964. I mention that in part because it has real world consequences. And I'll mention one personal one. Ennis has heard me tell this story before very briefly. My mother, I was growing up on Jacksonville's west side. At Jacksonville in the 1960s, in the view of many, was a slow-moving southern town with an inferiority complex. And many would say it was a smelly, slow-moving southern town with an inferiority complex. And then the schools became disaccredited. My dad was in the Navy. And my mother went to work to pull us out of public schools because the schools got disaccredited. And I went to Sacred Heart Elementary on Jacksonville's west side, had Sister Mary Paul in 1964. And all I wanted to say is that I spent a year memorizing the Mass in Latin. I said one Mass in Latin, and it went to English the next week. And I always wondered if Sacred Heart had gotten the memo from Rome that this is changed. And about 30 years later, I was talking to a priest from Sacred Heart, and I asked him, did you get the memo from Rome that this was changing? He said, yes, we did, Rick, but it was in Latin. That's why they didn't tell us. That's why I spent a year memorizing the Mass in Latin. But in a serious note, in the 1960s, the schools were disaccredited, public officials were indicted, putting it kind of directly, but raw sewage was being dumped into the river. And as John Delaney mentioned in a program when we were recognizing Consolidation, the 50-year anniversary, downtown was headed towards bankruptcy. It was the city in the midst of a full-blown crisis. In the midst of that crisis, some civic-minded leaders came together and they said, remember that 1934 amendment to the Florida Constitution? We have the opportunity to draw up a new charter, which is a fancy word for local constitution. And we can pass this charter with a vote of the people, and we can abolish the city government, abolish the county government, and put in its place this restructured form of government. And so they put together this charter. And in August of 1967, fairly dramatically, the people of Jacksonville went to the polls and voted by a 2-to-1 margin to abolish the city government, abolish the county government, and to have this new government put in place effective October 1st, 1968. I want to hurry up a little bit so you'll have time for questions, but let me just mention what went into effect on October 1st of 1968. There is no other government quite like this in the state of Florida, very unique and very few in the country. But let me mention to you, we adopted a federal model, more of a Madisonian model, very different from local government structures around the country. And let me briefly mention 5 pieces to this restructuring that I hope are helpful to understand and give you an insight into who we are and where we're heading. Number 1 was consolidation itself. This was the biggest piece of the restructuring. This was the abolition of the city government. This was the abolition of the county government. This was the creation of a new government with county-wide jurisdiction. The Duval County boundary became the city boundary. So consolidation meant a unified county, countywide. I often get the question, what about the 4 municipalities, Atlantic, Neptune, and Jax Beach and Baldwin? And the answer is they got to vote in 2 ways. They got to vote for overall consolidation, but they also got to vote on whether to retain their municipal status. They voted overwhelmingly for consolidation, and they also voted to retain their municipal status. And so today we still have those 4 municipalities. And the city of Jacksonville, the county, operates as a county government to them. So the number 1 piece was consolidation. Number 2, and this is really important, an important piece of it. This charter adopted a strong mayor form of government, meaning that the mayor would be the head of the executive branch, as opposed to a member of the city council subject to the Sunshine Law and simply having 1 vote. As head of the executive branch, of course, you give a budget address. That's why Mayor Curry gave a budget address in July. It would appoint department heads, could veto legislation. Mayor Curry is the 8th mayor in the history of our consolidated government. And if you contrast the difference between a weak mayor on a city council with a small municipality versus a strong mayor of a consolidated government, when you combine a consolidated government, which has which goes countywide, and a strong mayor, you can begin to see how significant leadership is in the mayor's office because of the way it works with consolidation. So you have consolidation, number 1. Number 2, you have a strong mayor form of government. Number 3, a revolution in legal services. The creation of the general counsel's office and the most unique delivery of legal services in the state of Florida, one of the most unique in the country. Pre-68, everybody had their own lawyer, and lawyers did what lawyers do, which is they generated big fees, which I'm not opposed to. And they also brought things to a halt, slowed things down. But there was a different model in 1968, the creation of the general counsel's office to provide legal services to all entities, the city, independent authorities, constitutional officers, and all entities of Jacksonville's consolidated government. This was extraordinary at the time. The first general counsel was Bill Durden. And as part of the general counsel's role, not only in providing legal services to all the entities of the consolidated government, there's also the role of being the chief legal officer, and of course, to issue what are known as binding legal opinions. So that if in fact there was a dispute, a legal dispute within the consolidated government, the general counsel could give an opinion that was binding on all of the consolidated government. Bill Durden, the first general counsel in the history of our city, issued over 200 binding legal opinions of the 400 total to get Jacksonville going. When I was general counsel, I did it for 13 years. I gave 10 binding legal opinions. Ed Austin used to say that the general counsel's office was the glue that held consolidated government together. I'll talk about in a second because it has strengths and weaknesses. And John Delaney has often said that the binding legal authority allowed also a former general counsel, as Ed Austin was, acted as sort of a supreme court for the consolidated government. The fourth piece of the restructuring was central services. Those central services include legal services, but included much more than that. It included procurement, the budget, and a variety of other financial pieces that were designed to tie the consolidated government together. And the fifth is hard to explain, but I'll do it in sort of simplistic terms. It took sovereignty from all the entities of the consolidated government to make them a part of the consolidated government, and this particularly related to the independent authorities. We call them independent authorities under our charter, but ironically, our independent authorities are less independent than special districts that exist around the state. And around the state, they're called special districts. They're not called independent authorities, such as the airport or the seaport. Those are special districts. There are over 1,500 special districts in the state of Florida. But what we did under our charter is we tried to make them a part of consolidated government. And one of the difference was mayoral appointments, for example. The mayor appoints, this is not typical of special districts around the state of Florida. The mayor appoints members of the Jacksonville Port Authority, appoints members of the Jacksonville Transportation Authority, of the Airport Authority, and all 7 members of the JEA. So you have mayoral appointments. You have the General Counsel's Office that provides legal services to all entities, those independent authorities, and you also have their budget submitted to city councils. That very quickly are sort of the 5 main pieces. There are others of the restructuring: consolidation, strong mayor, legal services, centralized services, and the independent authorities as a part of consolidated government. That restructuring went into effect on October 1st of '68. I know we'll have questions, but over the last half century, there have been a number of strengths. There have been a number of weaknesses. On the strength side, I'll just mention a couple briefly. One is something they talked about in New York when I testified before the Florida legislature and others, and that is taxes and efficiency. The notion that you can have lower taxes in a consolidated government because it's more efficient. I want you to picture what it's like in Miami-Dade or West Palm when you have a 2.7 million people in 35 municipalities with 35 police departments, 35 public works departments, 35 city attorney's offices, how overlapping and duplicative that can be. In Orange County, which includes Orlando, Orlando is one of 13 different municipalities within that county. Here in Duval County, the thought was the potential for greater efficiency and savings would lead to an ad valorem dividend. And for many years, that was true. We've had lower property taxes. Another is we don't sue each other. I was asked, why is that? The rest of the state sues each other all the time. County sues the city sues constitutional officers. And I've said teasingly, we gave them all the same lawyer. It tends to reduce the litigation when you give them all the same lawyer. That's a piece of it. Ed Austin used to say that there are 3 advantages: accountability, accountability, and accountability, because it was so overlapping previously. There's a law enforcement advantage because the Nat Glover and other sheriffs have been able to do this countywide. But let me just mention a couple quickly, then I want to talk briefly about some disadvantages or some weaknesses. One is, I mentioned this earlier, is the opportunity with a strong mayor and a consolidated government, the opportunity to address public policy on a countywide and even regional basis. That's really important for so many issues that dramatically affect the future of your county and your region. That includes economic development. That includes transportation. That includes the environment. That includes public safety. So there is what I would call a public safety advantage. There's also a separate advantage that I want to give credit to Ed Austin for his labor. He called it clout. I don't know if that's the right title for it, but let me describe it for you. And it's pretty significant, is that, and this requires leadership, by the way. A good structure, even an advantage structure, is not self-executing. It comes down to great leadership. But in a strong mayor form of government with this consolidation, there's the opportunity to leverage public assets and private assets in pursuit of policy objectives out of all proportion to our size. And I'll repeat that again, and then I'll tell you what that looks like. The opportunity, not the guarantee, but the opportunity to leverage public assets and private assets to build consensus in pursuit of objectives, policy objectives out of all proportion to our size. What does that look like? In my opinion, that looks like the Jacksonville Jaguars. In my opinion, that looks like the Better Jacksonville Plan. In my opinion, that looks like the Preservation Project, which means that certainly one of the strengths over the last 50 years have been the opportunity to build consensus for major policy initiatives. And consolidation with a strong mayor creates those great possibilities, but structural possibilities if you have the right leadership. But it also creates some challenges and some weaknesses. Let me talk about a few of those. That same centralization that same opportunity to leverage public and private assets in pursuit of major policy objectives because of centralization and building consensus also creates a challenge in centralization and being responsive to neighborhoods. That sometimes there's a concern that you're not being responsive to individual needs. And as Ennis mentioned, all the different neighborhoods in Duval County and being responsive. John Delaney's response to this was to actually create a neighborhood department. District council members, we have 14, we have 19 overall, CPACs and other attempts. But certainly centralization can be a two-edged sword and it takes great leadership. So you have to try to be responsive to neighborhoods. A second challenge in the eyes of many is downtown. John Payton gave a guest lecture in my class a few weeks ago. I teach a course on law and public policy in our MPP degree program. And he talked about how downtown can, in the view of some, can be disadvantaged because it doesn't have quite the advocate, and that the Downtown Investment Authority with Lori Boyer as the CEO, who does an extraordinary job, is in part response to that concern. I'm of a little bit of a different school of thought that says if you have a mayor in which downtown is a priority, such as it was with John Delaney, and as it is actually with Lenny Curry, those are just two examples, that mayor can leverage public and private assets for the pursuit of downtown. We can talk about downtown and revolutionizing. We have challenges downtown, of course. We're spread out as a city. We need more residential living downtown. We don't have the density, certainly, of San Francisco. Lots of challenges. But I do believe you're seeing dramatic changes underway under downtown. But one of the potential weaknesses in the eyes of many is that advocacy for downtown. A third is continuity. That sometimes in a strong mayor form of government, since you don't have a city manager, hard to carry on one policy to the next administration. John Payton can do a Jacksonville journey to fight crime, but it's up to those following him to continue such an effort. Another is that when consolidation was passed, it was, in the eyes of many, it was going to, not only it was going to do away with corruption, create accountability, avoid bankruptcy, but it was also going to lift up every community in Jacksonville and result in investments in underserved neighborhoods. And particularly in the Black community in District 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. It wasn't a specific number, like an X amount of money. It wasn't a specific policy, but it created the expectation that consolidation would lift all boats throughout countywide. And some view this as a mixed result, and it has varied by mayoral administration. For example, again, I mentioned John Delaney, who made big investments in underserved communities in the Better Jacksonville plan. So did Tommy Hazouri, and for the good news, the Curry administration is too. Other administrations have been a little more mixed on this because of financial challenges at the time, but that's something we can talk about. And finally, as one of the potential disadvantages, legal services. I mentioned how the general counsel's office is, in the eyes of Ed Austin, is the glue that holds consolidated government together. But there's also a concern among many on the general counsel's office as to whether it's a level playing field, whether it's biased for the mayor's office, and concerns about how it operates, and there should be appeals from binding legal opinions. I know I'm covering a lot of ground very quickly, but so let me just summarize with those are some advantages and disadvantages by saying this. In the end, I do believe, as Ed Austin said, and as Hans Tanzler said, and many others, that this restructuring back in 1968, we use the label of consolidation, but this form of government that we have, I believe, creates a structural competitive advantage for us with the right leadership. But it takes leadership. And one of our strengths is also our weakness. With the right leadership, particularly from the mayor's office, and this form of government, extraordinary things are possible. If we don't have that right leadership, we can languish. So it's not simply about structure, it's about leadership. And the other piece, on an optimistic note, I do want to leave you with this thought. I think many believe, and I'm sort of in this camp, that believes that for many years, we have underinvested in public education. Although we've invested in infrastructure, not enough, and particularly in downtown and underserved neighborhoods. If you take a look at the half-cent sales tax for education that was passed in 2020, 2 years ago in November, which is $1.9 billion that's going to go to public education countywide and throughout the neighborhood, and including the millage increase for referendum in August, I think our superintendent is going to go down as one of the most important and consequential superintendents in our history, representing a significant and historic investment in public education. If you take a look at the gas tax last year, spearheaded by the JTA, Nat Ford, and the mayor's office, $1 billion in public education, in infrastructure, including the Emerald Trail, as well as underserved neighborhoods in downtown, a really significant investment. And if you look at the CIP, the capital improvement plan, the 5-year plan for Mayor Curry, $500 million last year, $500 million this year. Those are the biggest investments since the historic investment of John Delaney and the Better Jacksonville plan for the $2.2 billion plan. I know I've gone too long, but this is my way of saying this. If Jacksonville was a stock, I would buy it. I believe that although we've had extraordinary challenges and difficulties in the past, I'm one of those people who's very optimistic about the future. Part of that optimism is our structure. Part of it is I believe capital and growth is flowing to Florida and to Jacksonville, and I believe great things lie ahead. And part of it is how we're positioned for the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Rick. That was excellent. So we do have a number of questions starting to roll in, and I have a number of questions myself, so I don't even know where to start. And I'm gonna sprinkle in some, planning perspective, I guess, from my background and kind of what I've been involved with in various cities as well in relation to this restructuring of government. So one of the first things I want to start off with, I'm going to just go to the Q&A box here. And going back to the beginning of the consideration of restructuring Jacksonville and Duval County's government. So was that a citizen-led initiative to lobby for that effort to change that amendment, or did it come from some other place?
That's a great question. I'm glad that was asked because quite frankly, sometimes I think we wait for government officials to move us forward, and we lose sight of the fact that citizens and civic-minded people and community statesmen can change the course of history. Actually, they had what was called the white hats and the black hats back in those days. And it turned out that much of city government was opposed. Much of city government was fearful for their own turf. You saw, for example, the Florida Times-Union was a proponent of consolidated government. Channel 4 was a proponent of consolidated government, and citizenry and civic-minded leaders were concerned, also came together. And so there was this sort of coming together as a community. They did a blueprint for the future, and a lot of it was civic-minded people who were concerned about public corruption, the indictments of city council members and the city commission, the sewage in the river, the potential bankruptcy. But in answer to your question, it was more citizen-led than it was government-led. And there were many heroes of consolidated government that came forward. But it was the 1934 amendment that provided the basis for it. But much like what you've seen, quite frankly, in some of the major initiatives that have helped move Jacksonville forward, it was a lot of the community coming together in advocacy for a change. That included the media. It did include the chamber. It included a lot of its citizenry, not as much on the governmental side.
Great. And now I'm going to just sprinkle in one of my questions here before jumping back to the Q&A box. And this is really kind of revolving around downtown and some of the things that we tend to hear within the community when it comes to the restructuring of our government. And yes, we have a 747 square mile city. Downtown always has traditionally struggled with someone to advocate for that. Yet there are some other cities out there that have similar styles of government that have vibrant downtowns. Nashville is one of them. So with that being said, what in your experience and in your opinion, what is the difference between what those places have gotten right in creating vibrant central cores and what Jacksonville's gotten wrong there over the years?
Hard question. And this has been studied a lot by a lot of people, but let me say this, and Ennis, I know you know this as an urban planner. We are really big. I mean, we are rich. Duval County is large, and we're very dependent on the automobile, and we're not very pedestrian friendly. And I'll use San Francisco as a contrast because you mentioned San Francisco earlier and how dense it was. And we visited there in the chamber years ago. And one of my greatest takeaways was how public transportation certainly there was aided by how densely populated there. So one of the challenges that we've had historically here in Jacksonville is dependency on the car. And I'm sure people watching this program to say, I'm all for public transportation, but I want my car. And I want to park my car in front of where I'm going. And I want to walk in. Everything's a 7-Eleven. I want to park right in front, go inside and come out to my car. And so certainly one of the challenges we've had is how spread out we are and car dependent. Another challenge, of course, is the need for downtown residential living. Good news on that front. Really, it takes about 10,000 or so residents to create the critical mass so that you can create a market so that we get capital flowing more downtown. And I think we're headed towards that. And I hope you have Lori Boyer on to talk about what's coming. But certainly one of our challenges has been downtown living. Another piece, the town center creates an interesting challenge for us too. And I think we should approach it complementary to the town center, because if you've been to the town center, that's been private capital has been flowing to the town center, and downtown has struggled. And in part of downtown, there's an effort now for residential living. There's an effort for retail, the building up of the sports complex. But I also think there's this notion of public and private investment in downtown. I think there was a debate among some as to whether we needed a vibrant downtown. I am squarely in the camp of we do. And part of what you're seeing now is very significant investments that I think are going to lead to private capital coming downtown. You've seen, I worked for a number of years at the old courthouse. It's been leveled, it's gone. You're going to see development there. The old city hall, it's gone, that's been leveled. The old Berkman is down. If you have Lori Boyer on, she'll talk to you about the capital that's flowing downtown. But certainly, I believe that Lori Boyer does an extraordinary job at DIA. I do think we've had some challenges in investment. We've had challenges in residential living, but we now have workforce housing that's coming up all over downtown. We have some extraordinary projects coming downtown. We have some critical investments downtown. Mayor Curry, about a year ago, said that in 5 years, you won't recognize downtown. I actually think he's right about that. I am one of the people who is very optimistic about what the future of downtown looks like. This also highlights, and it's another theme, which is structure is one thing and leadership is another. And I do believe you have seen consolidated governments around the country with vibrant downtowns. I don't believe it's as much a structural issue here as it is a leadership issue. And I think that we're getting some good leadership in a number of places. So although it's been slow in coming, I believe it is coming. I do believe that the financial crisis really hit us hard, unique downtown back in 2008, 2009 in particular, because we did have some momentum. We've been kind of stagnant for a bit, but I think we're regaining that momentum, and I'm optimistic about what downtown's going to look like.
That's great. That's great.
Ennis, do you share that? You're the planner. I'd love to hear, if I'm allowed to ask you, I'd love to hear your views on what the future of downtown's going to look like.
Sure. I mean, so, my views would be somewhat a little different, but I mean, I'm very optimistic about downtown. I actually think from a market rate perspective, if it's not so much government structure as you mentioned, but I almost think if government took its hands out of the cookie jar a little bit, naturally there has been a market globally for a certain type of lifestyle, a certain type of living. And so there are some things from a public policy perspective that we create stumbling blocks within the market. So there's some things that we can twitch here and there to support the market. And I think we'd actually see downtown flourish a lot quicker and better. And similar thing would be for urban core neighborhoods in terms of a rising tide lifts all boats. I'm from the hood. That's kind of where I grew up at. I don't necessarily believe you rain from the top down. You also have to have something come from the bottom up. And really, when we talk about the promises that were made to various neighborhoods, it's not the government structure per se, but we still have public policies that were discriminatory at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level, that occurred all throughout the early 20th century that have built this foundation environment where we're at today. So regardless of our government structure, if we don't address those policies, such as rail line and things of that nature, we're still going to suffer from the same elements. Town center. I would be someone as a planner who would say, we subsidize a lot of that development in the way our policies are today. So it's not necessarily market rate there. There is no town center if we didn't build a JTV. There is no town center if we didn't publicly invest in 295 and all that infrastructure. And that's billions of dollars. So I see this as not just that Jacksonville, it's US in general, but there are a lot of things that I think we can do in downtown and other areas that deal more with public policy to support the market or create obstacles within the market. And that's what we struggle from in some arears. I know I said a lot there, more than you actually.
Oh, no, listen, I think that's very thoughtful and helpful. I'd like to mention one piece for everyone viewing today that on an optimistic note that I have to admit my bias in liking this. First of all, I think Nat Ford is one of the really fine leaders here in North Florida. He's the CEO of the Jacksonville Transportation Authority. I also happen to feel that the 6-cent gas tax increase that passed a year ago has been extended with the divvying up of 3 cents to the JTA and 3 cents to the city is going to result in some really important investments in infrastructure. And by the way, infrastructure lays the foundation, I hope, for future capital investment. But one piece I wanted to mention, and this is where I give Nat Ford a lot of credit because it was a part of passing it. Policy initiatives, I think, require selling it to the community and the flexibility to compromise. And that was the inclusion of the Emerald Trail when it wasn't originally included within the proposal. I happen to be hopeful that the Emerald Trail in particular, which is a network of about 30 miles of connections within downtown, is going to be very, very positive in the long run for downtown. There are a number of specific initiatives. We certainly don't have to talk about all of them, but that one in particular, they only put about 130 to 140 million. I think it's going to take more than that. But when you look at McCoy's Creek downtown and Hogan's Creek downtown and the Emerald Trail, if we look to the future, I think some of these timely investments can make a really big difference longer term in the future of Jacksonville. And that's one I want to highlight. I mean, those that get the attention, understandably so, are very exciting. The Four Seasons on the riverfront is exciting. I happen to believe taking down the ramp for the Isaiah Hart Bridge was disappointing to some, but in the long run is going to serve us well. I think the workforce housing that's coming is helpful, but you are clearly correct that everybody needs to participate. And I do think there are some efforts being made to do that. And I give some credit to the Curry administration in its CIP and its capital budget, particularly as it relates to neighborhoods and some critical investments in septic tank remediation and in removing septic tanks, which are costly. I mean, it's a big, big ticket item to do. But there are some initiatives recently that give me a lot of hope for optimism. But your point is very well taken that for lots of reasons, historical and otherwise, we have a lot to overcome.
And thank you for mentioning the Emerald Trails. You know, I'm actually a Groundworks Jacksonville board member. And, you know, the trail is an example how I use JTB as an example of infrastructure that influenced development in the South Side. The Emerald Trail itself is a piece of infrastructure that can positively influence redevelopment, revitalization within the urban core. And, you know, it's going to be important for us in terms of the policy perspective to make sure that redevelopment lifts and rises and raises the people who live in the neighborhoods today. And, you know, not a thing, say, like the Beltline in Atlanta, which has gentrified a lot of those areas and displaced a lot of people within the historic communities. And I think we're at the front end of this, so we have a great opportunity to get this right and put something in place that can really benefit the urban core of Jacksonville. So I got a number of questions rolling in here now. So
okay.
I'm going to try to get through them here. So this is going to be more of a general question because we are talking a lot of history here that many people may not have been aware of and may want to have more access to more information. So with that being said, is there a great book out there that you can recommend that speaks to the history of our government restructuring here?
I recommend A Quiet Revolution by Richard Martin. Here at the Public Policy Institute, we have a master's degree in public policy. One of the required courses is Law and Public Policy, which is a class I teach. And required reading in the course is that book, A Quiet Revolution by Richard Martin. And it has an appendix or an update by Chris Hand at the end of it. And so you can get it at the Jacksonville Historical Society. I recommend that book. I believe our institutional knowledge is important. I believe our history is important. That's why I welcome the chance to be with you today. I'm getting a little bit older myself. I'm passing the baton on to Ennis and others to have an understanding and a knowledge of what led to consolidation, what the pieces were, what the strengths have been, what the weaknesses have been, and what it means to our future. I think it's really important to understand this for our future. And so that's a long-winded way of saying that is certainly one of the books that I would recommend is A Quiet Revolution by Richard Martin.
And I am a owner of that book, and I will also make that recommendation as well. All right, let's see. Going to move back to the Q&A function here. Next question is going to be Could you discuss the relationship between Jacksonville's racial politics in the 1960s and the 1967 vote in favor of consolidation?
Yeah, boy, I'll tell you, this is a really challenging topic, and I think it's important to go back in time and to be candid about where we were. Brown versus Board of Education was 1954. It may seem like that may seem like a long time ago, but really not so long a time ago when the schools in Duval County became accredited in 1964. This is 1954, just 10 years earlier. And it was, in my opinion, after Marbury versus Madison, the most significant US Supreme Court case in the history of our country. And it was one of the first real, there were others, but this is the first real step towards addressing what was clear throughout the country and in Duval County, which was the structural racism. And Brown versus Board of Education was the first piece. If you want a consequence to that, it wasn't by accident that a few years later, there was a Forest High School, and the feeder schools were that's a college. It was Jeb Stewart and Jeff Davis. The reason I know this is I'm a graduate of Forest High School, which is now West Side High School. I grew up on the west side of Jacksonville, and it was a spinoff from Robert E. Lee. And in the 1960s, there is no doubt that Jacksonville, and we weren't unique in this, this was true throughout the country, we're struggling with the Civil Rights Amendment, the Civil Rights legislation, 1965. So this is the height of the Civil Rights Movement and the height of challenges in trying to correct and trying to address the challenges of racism that were so dramatic during that time. There are a number of different schools of thought as to how this affected the move towards consolidation. One of the people that I like to quote, of course, is Earl Johnson on this, who at the time, he may have changed later, but who became the first Black city council president, but at the time favored consolidation, in part because, as he said, he didn't want to be mayor of a bankrupt city. But remember this too, pre-consolidation, the mayor of Jacksonville was a weak mayor, not the same as the strong mayor we have today. And so there are some, and I don't doubt that there were some people in Jacksonville who had their racist reasons for it, who some believe that there was a racial motivation behind consolidation. I'm not in that camp. After having interviewed and read and talked to a number of people on it, when I take a look at the grand jury indictments and the public corruption, when I take a look at the environmental problems with what was going on with the river and the sewage in the river, and I've taken a look at the bankruptcy that was pending downtown and the challenges that we faced, I believe that the community citizens that came together truly did believe that a massive restructuring was necessary to address the crisis at the time. I will say this too, and I think this is important to recognize the arc of history. In 1995, John Delaney was elected as the first Republican mayor since Reconstruction. In that very same election, Nat Glover was elected as the first and only Black sheriff in the 20th century in the state of Florida. I want you to think about that. We had one Black sheriff in the 20th century in the state of Florida, and that was elected here in Duval County in 1995. Of course, in 2011, Alvin Brown was elected mayor. I know that race pretty well because some of you may not know this. I ran for mayor back in 2011. I did really well on everything except votes. And so I've suggested to people if they run for office, they should focus on votes. But to Alvin Brown's credit, he was elected. And I want you to take a look at the leadership today. Take a look at the sheriff's race with Lakeisha Brown and TK Waters. Take a look at Audrey Gibson running for mayor. Take a look at the head of the Jacksonville Transportation Authority, the school district, the Jacksonville Port Authority, Derek Green. I believe that in the arc of history, Jacksonville has come a long way, but there's certainly no denying the challenges of the 60s and currently challenges we obviously still have today. But I do believe that we're in a different place today fundamentally than we were back in the 1960s, certainly back in the early 60s.
Well, I've got another question here. It's going to piggyback off of that one. I'm going to skip around a bit, but I think you partially answered your position on it, but I want to add a little bit, add my 2 cents to it. So this question is, are we sure consolidation wasn't just a result of Jacksonville becoming a minority city in the 1960s, the white power structure wanting to consolidate in order to stay in power by incorporating the white suburbs?
Yeah, I know there are some who believe that. I'm not in that camp. I don't believe that. I believe the driving force behind consolidation. Remember, there was a desire it was considered in the 1930s too with a similar motivation. I think the driving force was public corruption, and that public corruption was dramatic. I think the driving force was a financial collapse, which was imminent, environmental concerns, and some of the others that I have talked about. There's no doubt that at that time there were certain people that may have been their motivation, but I don't believe so. But I can tell you this, certainly today, James Ruth was certainly one of the first judges, black judge who I used to work with. We were prosecutors together, elected countywide. Certainly today, I believe that it's a level playing field. Do I think it was a level playing field back then? I don't think so. But I don't believe that was the driving force behind consolidation. And in the other communities that's happened around the country, I can't speak to each of their circumstances, but here the crisis was dramatic. It was the most significant in our history. And that 1934 amendment provided the constitutional basis for a restructuring that led to, as I mentioned, sort of the big five: consolidation, strong mayor, general counsel's office, centralized legal services, and independent authorities. I believe that today, with the right leadership, it positions us well for the future.
I'll just, add to that as well. Certainly, I can see in the 1960s, anything put in place back in those days, it's going to have some level of race probably involved in it at some point. But as a planner, I would say, there's more than likely chance we kind of avoided a big negative scenario. I don't know if people had opportunity to go up to DC and visit the National Museum of African American History and Culture, but it does talk about urban planning and kind of the politics of the 1960s and what was going on in cities from across the country. And one of the struggles that many cities faced was that there was this, the population was leaving the cities. You had a decline in tax base. So many of cities that had their first African-American mayors at that point in time were cities with headed into bankruptcy. Many of these cities still struggle today. And it's not the race of who was the mayor. It basically boiled down to a decline in tax base and no way to turn that around. So when we look at places like, say, East St. Louis or Camden, New Jersey, Gary, Indiana, Jacksonville was pretty much in the same space. Back in 1960, Jacksonville was actually the same size as Flint, Michigan. And if we, today, I'm pretty sure we could all agree that Jacksonville is going in one direction and Flint, Michigan has gone in a different direction. And part of that is being able to get a hold of the tax base through a restructuring government. Now, you've mentioned a lot about leadership and having good leadership kind of drive this restructured government. So in your opinion, how would you define good leadership or correct leadership?
Well, it's a tough one, obviously, but I can tell you the qualities on the great leaders that I admire most. And I'll give you an example. Yesterday, we welcomed the Louisville Chamber of Commerce here to Jacksonville University. About 130 people from Louisville flew here to talk about Jacksonville's government. And here at Jacksonville University, we hosted them, and I conducted a 50-minute fireside chat with Mayor Curry, and then a 50-minute sort of fireside chat with former Mayor John Delaney. And in that fireside chat, I gave an example of something I consider to be good leadership. And I'll mention this, and then I'll talk about your qualities in a second. But in John Delaney's term, he was the first Republican mayor since Reconstruction. He had cut taxes, but he wanted to do a $2.2 billion investment in infrastructure, and it required a half-cent sales tax. He had political advisors. I remember the team. I was there at the meeting among his team that voted 17-3 against him doing it. I flew to Washington with Mayor Delaney and another person of the team to meet with some very respected consultants in DC who told him that he should not do this. But Mayor Delaney was convinced that it was the right thing for the future of the city. And even though they told him it would be the end of his political career, and he did it anyway because he thought it would pass and it was important to the future of the city, which leads to one of the qualities I want to mention for great leadership. And it's kind of sorely lacking at the national, state, and local level, and that is the courage to do what's right, regardless of what it means to the politician personally. To not act in self-interest. I think if you look nationally, statewide, and locally, It's more common than not to see elected officials acting in self-interest. And every now and then we will see a leader come along, a true statesperson who cares about a community before self, who's willing to put the community first and to have the courage to pursue policy pursuits that are right for the community that may not be best for them politically. Now, they have to be pretty wise when they choose those. You can't do that on everything or else you'll be out of office. And as Lacey Mahan once said, the most ineffective legislator is the one who's not serving. So I'm not suggesting that they become unpopular for popularity's sake. But I think when we look at the qualities of great leadership, we want someone who can attract talent. We want someone who can leverage that talent, someone who listens, someone who has vision, someone who has the courage and is a statesperson and cares about the future of our community. Hard to get all those qualities in one place. I like to talk here at the Institute with our students about the perfect storm of bad public policy, which is short-term thinking and benefits now and you pay for the bill later, which is the opposite of a perfect storm of good public policy to me, which is long-term thinking in great leaders, long-term thinking, sacrifice now, such as a half-cent sales tax and an infrastructure, with the benefits to come over time. And I think if we have the kinds of leaders that think long-term, that put the community before themselves, and that have the courage to do what's right for the future of community, that's a rare find. But those are the kind of qualities I'm looking for in great leadership. It's rare, but I hope we can find it.
All right. So this next one is a comment, and maybe you want to provide some feedback here. So it seems to me that the urban core has suffered a lot from consolidation on several fronts, mainly because there is a lack of sufficient representation for urban neighborhoods, and the substantial suburban lean on council leads to fundamental misunderstandings of how to address urban problems.
Can you repeat that one more time? Because I was making some notes. Go ahead.
So it seems to me that the urban core has suffered a lot from consolidation on several fronts, mainly because there is a lack of sufficient representation for urban neighborhoods, and the substantial suburban lean on the council leads to fundamental misunderstandings of how to address urban problems.
Yeah, it's not a view I share. I don't believe that that the core is the result. It's not the result of consolidation. I don't believe it's a structural issue. I really don't. I understand what's talking about is that they do touch upon this concern over neighborhoods. I do believe that the urban core was suffering long before consolidated government. We had challenges in the urban core pre-1968. In fact, those challenges were even more severe than they are today. And I do believe that in District 7, 8, 9, and 10 in particular, that those representatives and the work we're doing today is resulting in the kinds of investments and discussions of dedicated revenue streams that I think that I'm hopeful in the long run are going to, it won't happen overnight. The things I mentioned earlier, this historic investment we're making in education downtown and in underserved communities through the half-cent sales tax, the gas tax, the property tax increase in the CIP isn't flipping a switch. But I think the question is a really thoughtful and good one, because it gets us to think about the question of structure versus leadership, and whether or not because structure isn't self-executing, is whether or not does the structure, it's a fair question, does the structure hurt downtown, for example? Does the structure hurt neighborhoods? As I mentioned earlier, I do believe this, one of the strengths is centralization, but one of the difficulties can be neighborhoods, and urban core neighborhoods are part of that discussion. But I do believe that through the neighborhoods department, district representatives, and leadership in the mayor's office, that there's actually a greater opportunity to turn around disadvantaged neighborhoods than there would be otherwise. And I believe, and I'm hopeful that's going to happen. So I think it's a thoughtful question and a fair question, but I don't necessarily share that view.
And this is a particular topic where, you know, as a historian, I love to just dive back into, you know, the history of Jacksonville. And yes, you're certainly right. There are a lot of things in the urban core that what we see today is a result of things from policies from 100 years ago that have continued to manifest themselves. You know, we had Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, who brought us, you know, separate but equal, or Jim Crow, if we want to call it that. We were the first city in Florida to have a comp plan or a zoning plan, which was Euclidean in nature, which is basically a separation of zoning policies. But it created a tale of two zip codes, the haves versus the have-nots. We had certain neighborhoods that were protected through zoning and the value and the property values of those neighborhoods that going up as a result. On the other hand, to help protect those particular neighborhoods, this is way back in the 1920s and 30s, we had other neighborhoods where we allowed heavy industries, sewage plants, waste incinerators that have impacted people's health, the thing that we call environmental justice today. That same policy ushers into the 1930s and 40s when you get into public housing acts that give you housing projects, which were really targeted in certain areas as a early form of what we call urban renewal today. We have the construction of the interstate system. If we looked at the neighborhoods that were redlined in the 1930s, those neighborhoods that were classified as hazardous are definitely declining. If you look at every piece of significant interstate freeway construction that was done in that area at that period of time, it all falls into those particular areas. And so a lot of things we're struggling with today, we're struggling with that infrastructure, we're struggling with that policy that was put in place prior to the 1960s. And so one of our challenges moving forward, which is an opportunity in terms of a centralized government with the right leadership, would be we can go back and tackle these policies and fix things that have hurt different communities, modify them in a way that can help benefit communities, help preserve various cultures within our community. And so that's something that's just really important. I think when we're talking about Jacksonville, is to really hone down on the history of how we got here today. And we've been here since, the city's been here since 1822. People were here before that. There's a long legacy of things that have led to our environment today.
And as I want to mention something, if I could, I thought that was really well stated, the history, and for those with the concern about the legal piece, when you mentioned Plessy versus Ferguson from 1896, let me just mention, of course, that was the Supreme Court said that separate but equal was constitutional and resulted in the legal segregation. And when I mentioned Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, that was the Supreme Court case that actually overturned Plessy versus Ferguson. It reversed, which gives you a sense of over a half a century of that structural racism as a part of the fabric of what we were doing. I think your historical review and recounting of that is really insightful and helpful. But to put the arc of history, that Plessy piece goes all the way to 1954, which wasn't that long ago to me. Before Plessy was even overturned.
Right. And even that, over the course of those 50, 60 years, you have the income gap that has grown at that point in time. You have the built environment that we see today. Some neighbors have shotgun houses, some have brick homes. All this kind of dates back to that policy that is kind of level, that grows on top of each other as time goes on. And that's something that we have to kind of fight to pull apart, but this form of government could be an opportunity to tackle a lot of those tough issues like that. I'm gonna jump back to the chat box now. And this next question is, let's see, is it time for the equivalent of a constitutional revision on a level of focus as the original effort to address the issues that time has revealed, specifically a centralized structure in a decentralized world? So I'm gonna read that one again. It is it time for the equivalent of a constitutional revision on a level of focus as the original effort to address the issues that time has revealed, and that's specifically the creation of a centralized structure in a decentralized world?
It's a very good question. And let me say this, under our charter, we actually have our local constitution. We actually have what's called the Charter Revision Commission that does that every 10 years. And in fact, I think it was in 2009 or maybe 2010, I testified before them on this topic that you're just mentioning, the centralization and some of the challenges in a decentralized world, but also the pros and cons and an overall assessment of consolidated government. The Constitution, the Charter Revision Commission meets every 10 years. And this is one of the big topics it took up, and it just concluded its review, I believe, a year or two ago. I don't recall exactly, because it does meet every 10 years. But structurally, we do conduct that review every decade, and that has always been a big part of the conversation.
And our next question may not be so much on our topic here, but I'll just toss it out there and I'll add my 2 cents in as well. So with all of the homeless shelters downtown and the jail, what direct or indirect impact is that on our downtown?
Well, Ennis, I'm going to talk to you as the urban planner and ask you to comment on that a little, because I think you have greater insight and expertise than me on that.
So, I'm one, as an urban planner, I do get to travel around a lot and I've worked in a number of projects in various cities across the country. And quite frankly, the ideal of homeless in downtown, jails in downtown, that's not just unique to Jacksonville. I know, we talk a lot about our jail on the waterfront. I don't know if anybody's been down to Fort Lauderdale recently, but they also have a jail on the waterfront. And they have one of the most rapidly growing, vibrant downtowns in the state of Florida. So it's not so much the homeless in downtown or the jail in downtown that impacts growth. It gets back again to policies, in my opinion. It gets back into how we market things. For example, I'm someone who would say St. John's Town Center has no bearing on downtown Jacksonville. Downtown Jacksonville, the struggles that it has faced, the struggles it is fighting to overcome, were taking place a long time before St. John's Town Center even came up on the scene. Downtown is a neighborhood in our city. Now it has a lot of regional draw, but in essence, it is a neighborhood. We have to do things that create a self-contained environment and appeal to the people who want to be there today. I'm one of those people, I'm not going to worry too much about attracting someone from Oakleaf to come downtown. If I can get the basics right, we can create what we call the 3 C's. You cluster and complement the uses in the compact setting. When you can do that, synergy tends to happen. So, it's sort of like we're a 4 square mile downtown. If it were me, I'd just funnel as much money and things as I could into a 2 or 3 block section, and we would have the best 2 or 3 blocks of a downtown in America. And I guarantee if you could achieve that, it will grow and spawn out from that. And as that synergy is built, it naturally pulls in people from surrounding areas that we think are more interested in the town center, which town center, by the way, there's a million of those things all over. Fort Lauderdale's got a lot of them. Miami has a lot of them. Orlando has a lot of them. But guess what? They also have interactive in downtown. So that's something we can achieve. They also have homeless that they have to deal with and work with as well. So I don't think that the homeless or the jail is the main factor in what we can or can't achieve with our downtown. Oh wow! I just talked this out of. So yeah, so I see it's 1:23. So what I want to do is I'm going to scan through here real quick. I don't see any additional questions, but if anyone has one, I would give you an opportunity to throw in the box pretty quick. In the meantime, I do just want to circle back around and say, kind of go over our learning objectives of today. And we hope that we've been able to accomplish this, but we really wanted this session to let participants better understand what consolidation or the reconstruction of our government is and what it is not. Have a full breadth of government restructuring that took place during consolidation, better understand how Jacksonville compares to other consolidated cities or cities with restructured forms of government, better understand the unexpected outcomes of consolidation, and then just highlight again the challenges and opportunities that we face today as a result of the restructured government that we have. All right, so I don't think I see anything else pop up, but it is 1:25, so I'll just go into closing mode here. So Rick, before I start to close things out, I want to just kind of turn it over to you and see if there's anything else you would like to add to today's discussion.
Well, one word I would have is a spirit of optimism about the future. I think there's a tendency to beat ourselves up a little bit. I think there's a tendency to look at the things that haven't gone the way that we would like. But I actually believe that there are lots of reasons to be optimistic. And by the way, some of those are macro factors that are beyond Jacksonville. Article in the Wall Street Journal today about the flight and the growth that's coming from the north here into Florida and to Duval County. Keep this in mind here in Duval County. Capital is coming to Duval County. Growth is coming to Duval County. Some communities are in decline, some are stagnant, and some have growth in their future. And we're better off with growth, but we have to manage it smartly. I believe with our unique form of local government, we are well positioned with the right leadership to take this opportunity for growth and capital, our riverfront, our ocean, and this terrific location that we have for extraordinary things to serve for the people of Jacksonville. But we have to do it with the kind of thinking I mentioned earlier, to think long-term about our future, to think unselfishly about our future, to talk about sacrifices we can make now for a better future, and to think about the possibilities. And I think for the people that are here today, you can help shape that future. I really believe that. The people on this call today, or the people visiting today, or here today, can participate in that. And so I do think that there's a tendency for us to look at the things that haven't gone the way we would have liked. But I do want to suggest that I personally am very optimistic about the possibilities for our future. And part of that is our structure, but part of it is attracting good quality people for leadership in local government. Pleasure being with all of you, and good being with you, Ennis. Thank you.
And thank you. I agree with everything you said there as well. Jacksonville, we do have a very bright future, and we should all be happy to participate in the continued enhancement of quality of life in all our residents within our community. So this event is the fourth of 6 virtual discussions in the 2022 2 Centuries of Jacksonville series, which is co-produced by the Jessie Ball duPont Fund and myself for the Jacksonville Magazine. And this event today was also sponsored by the First Coast section of the American Planning Association's Florida chapter. The first 3 events of this series, which were the African American cemeteries, the benefits of blue zones, and placemaking vs. placekeeping, were held in February, April, and June of this year. And if you missed them, they're all pretty good. They are recorded and available for your review. Our 5th event will be hosted virtually in November. And so we love to have you join us there. We'll be focusing on migration and mobility. So stay tuned for more details by following the Jackson Mag on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, or the Jessie Ball duPont Fund. So in closing, I do want to thank you again, Rick, for taking the time to join us today. I just want to thank all our participants as well for joining us this afternoon, and we'll see you next time.